At first glance, Passover appears to be the easiest Jewish holiday to understand. After all, God redeemed his people from Egypt precisely as the Almighty told Abraham he would, going back to Genesis chapter 15. It seems like the meal that we're going to enjoy this evening, the Passover Seder, is just least complicated and require least explanation to comprehend. It's a night where we celebrate redemption, but that's where the complications begin. The Passover meal, of all things, is called a Seder. A Seder doesn't mean redemption at all. Rather, Seder conveys an order, and if you want to know what that order is, it's right there in the Haggadah, the literature that we read at this Passover meal. There is a definite order, 15 stages, and we go through that order throughout the evening. Order, is that a name that marks the greatest redemption in human history and also marks the birth of the Jewish nation? That's how Exodus essentially begins. Genesis defines the choice and selection of the forefathers of the Jewish people, a unique family, and the book of Exodus marks, solidifies, identifies a nation with which God has a covenant. And of course, the book of Exodus begins describing the remarkable event that occurred a little more than 3,300 years ago. Order, it's not the name that I would choose, and I don't think you would either, but it gets even more complicated than that. The very theme that's outlined in this most elaborate meal of the year, the Passover Seder, the Passover order, almost begs the participant to ask questions. And that's understandable. After all, the Torah identifies this evening, the Passover Seder evening, as a night when questions are asked of the Father, and the Father in turn responds. This tradition of asking and answering, retelling from father to son, from father to son, is identified in the Torah as one of the mitzvos, the Gad to Levincha, and you should tell your children. So the information that's conveyed is not only in a book, in a written form, but it's a generational question and answer. Your children will ask you, and you will tell them. And the children do ask. They ask 4 questions, and they're encouraged to ask many more. In fact, that's how the whole evening progresses. And it's a mitzvah in the Torah to talk about the going out of Egypt. It's one of the most singular important mitzvot, commandments, that occurs on the Passover evening. It's very important that Jewish holidays in general, and Passover in particular, is about fathers telling their children, passing on the story of the formidable event of the Jewish people and became a nation and encountered God in a national revelation at Mount Sinai. If you weren't prepared to ask questions, the author of the Haggadah, the Baal Haggadah, ensures that you would, because almost every page begs questions. Every page of the Haggadah triggers fundamental questions. For example, the themes that are covered this evening seem to be completely contradictory. At first glance, we're called upon to remember the pain. We eat matzah, the poor man's bread. We hold it up, thin matzah. Moror, we eat bitter herbs. Also, to remember a time when our nation for centuries were enslaved in Egypt. We're called upon to remember that, in fact, the bitterness of our history wasn't just contained to a remarkable event more than 3,300 years ago, but in fact, in every generation, our nation, our people would confront bitterness and God would somehow save them. If that's not complicated enough, we're supposed to also exhibit extraordinary happiness and comfort, acting as though we're free men rather than people who are enduring bitterness and poverty. We dip vegetables in salt water. We recline as wealthy free men do, not as slaves do. Well, which is it? What's the theme here? And in fact, in the four questions that the children ask their father, is divided exactly in that way. The first two questions relate to the matzah and the maror, and the second two questions relate to the dipping and reclining, but it's really throughout. The salt water reminds us of tears. We're not to break the bone of the Passover lamb because, after all, that's how slaves eat. Morsels of meat, perhaps a bone, they break it and suck out the marrow. Rich people don't do that. They simply toss away the bones. We're not to break the bone of the lamb, but rather eat in a state of fullness, ala sova. That means we're not famished poor people. Which is it? What are we supposed to be experiencing this evening? We have the charoset, this really delicious mixture of nuts and grape juice and dates and sweet things and mixed together, cobbled together in this paste that we dip the mortar in, and the charoset, which is really quite tasty, was to remind us of the cement, the mortar used by our forefathers in Egypt. Again, slavery. Which is it? Are we recalling pain or freedom? We can't break the bone because we're not to behave like poor people, but we're supposed to behave like poor people, like by eating a poor man's bread and salt water and murr, the bitter herbs. The conflicts just don't end. And it triggers questions. And that's what the Bal Haggadah, that's what the authors of the Haggadah wanted. They wanted to trigger questions. This is not a holiday where we simply recall the past. We know that we're enduring this all in the present to a glorious destiny. In our thought, a person really can't appreciate freedom unless you first endure pain. People who are born to wealthy families, they're raised by maids and nannies. Whatever they want, they have. And very frequently, the children of wealthy, free people, they have no appreciation for what they have. People who came from countries that are run by despots and somehow their families escaped. Well, the first generation really appreciates freedom, but the second generation rarely does. The third generation, it's forgotten, but not for the children of Israel. In fact, the Torah tells us frequently, not just frequently, but in fact the most repeated commandment in the Torah is to be kind to the stranger. It's a mitzvah that's repeated more frequently than any other commandment in the Bible, to be kind to the stranger. Why? Why does God expect of you so much to be so sensitive? Because you too were strangers in a foreign land. And that kind of addresses another question about Passover, as though there weren't enough. As it turns out, why are we thanking God for freeing us from slavery? After all, He's the one that put us there in the first place. I mean, if someone were to take you and throw you in prison, and then sometime later free you, would you be thankful? Perhaps. But why'd you put us here in the first place? It's to produce a nation that would understand, would grasp the importance of freedom, the value of freedom, and what it's like to be not just a poor man, but a strange man in a strange land. You've got to experience the matzah and the maror in order to really grasp the value of dipping and reclining. Passover Seder is filled with questions. It's questions triggered by numbers as well. You don't have to be numerate to notice that the number 4 comes up quite a bit in the theme of Passover throughout the night. 4 cups of wine, 4 questions, 4 sons. Why? If you have even a perfunctory knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, specifically the prophets, you'd be very acquainted with 4 enemies of the Jewish people. Abraham, after all, defeated 4 enemies in Genesis chapter 13 and 14, and then receives the blessing from Melchizedek, who was, according to Jewish tradition, Shem. 4. The 4 doesn't stop there. Daniel, famously in chapter 7, has a non-veridical vision. In it, he's made to see the enemies of the children of Israel. The lion with wings, how odd. The bear with 3 ribs. The leopard with 4 heads. And then something so horrible and indescribable, it causes Daniel to recede in fear and beg the angel for more explanation. A beast with 10 horns and another little horn. What could that possibly be? Daniel suspected it was bad and was horrible. And the angel explains this will be the final kingdom that would subjugate our people, more horrible than the first 3. Something that would cause the people to tremble. According to Jewish tradition, this is the Roman Empire. It's Edom, the 10 horns. Those 10 are the 10 emperors of Rome until the one that destroyed the Second Temple, from Julius Caesar to Vespasian. One point should be made: Julius Caesar technically was not an emperor. Rather, he was a dictator. We'll call him emperor for now. What's that final horn? That's Titus, who was the general of the Roman Empire during the destruction of the Second Temple, who would go on to become the emperor of Rome. An enemy more fierce than any other in history. And God tells us He will save us from all our enemies. And that's where the 4 is, the 4 horses. We find this in Zechariah 4, 4 chariots. Why 4? It's your 4 implacable enemies that would seek to destroy you. But there's a 5th. The fifth kingdom is the messianic kingdom. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Mashiach comes. He's called the Son of Man because he's mortal. He's not the son of a virgin. He comes with clouds. Those are the clouds of glory. To the Ancient of Days, that's the one who keeps his promise, the God of Israel. And he's the fulfillment of the Davidic dynasty, and therefore all nations, not just some, will serve him and recognize that he is the heir to a promise that God made to King David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It's a remarkable journey, the Passover Seder, a night that is designed to invoke questions, to trigger and fuel curiosity, to understand what it would take to become a remarkable nation. I need not tell you that the nation we are today is not the nation we were on October 6th. None of us are the same. None of us will ever be the same after what occurred on October 7th. We never will be the same. Bear in mind that more than 100 hostages are being held now in Gaza. They're not going to be able to celebrate the Passover Seder. Our hearts are with them, our prayers are with them, that they too would be redeemed and come home. You will never be the same person you were before October 7th. None of us will. Why this tragic event occurred, I can't tell you, but I can tell you this: we'll never be the same. Our nation, our people, in fact, the world will never be the same, ever. Why, I don't know, but I can assure you this: we're not the same people anymore. None of us are. What had to happen? Very bitter. Tremendous pain. And then we emerge as a unified nation with one heart. Not just a singular past that's remarkable, but a singular destiny, and that's a promise from the God of Israel. Chag Sameach. Happy Passover. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה